All right, we'll say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Tosim Mishpacha B'Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shimon Droshos this year. Zechus for Besoros Tovos Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Stephen Abadin Lotova Stephen Tarizin. Loving memory of Steve's mother, Doris Zin Devora Bas Rabbi Sol Yoel. Zichron Lebracha, week of learning sponsors. Jeff Schwartz, permission of his father's yahrzeit. Shmuel Ben Shimon Halevi, Zichron Lebracha. Anonymous sponsorship with tremendous gratitude to the entire share for gentle encouragement, starting to do that Yomi over 2,700 days ago from Zara. Celebrating Siyam Shas and Emeres Hashem, beginning round 2. Binyamin Fleischman, in memory of Rabbi Shmuel Yodel Ben Binyamin Yaakov Zichron Lebracha. May his neshama have an aliyah. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas have an aliyah. The families in the Chama, all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Kadosh Baruch Hu should Emeres Hashem provide aliyah for the neshamas of all the precious soldiers who were killed in the roadside bomb in Gaza. Shemeres Hashem give nechama to their mishpachas. Cheshbarach Hu Shemeres Hashem bring more hostages. Bekarov. Shemeres Hashem give incredible siyata d'shmaya to our holy soldiers. Should give shmiri yisir to our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael and Halavai. Shemeres Hashem continue to give hatzlacha, beracha, and Emeres Hashem victory to Klal Yisrael, to Am Yisrael, to Eretz Yisrael. Well, so with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Zayin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. We are picking up on Vav Amud Beis 6b, and we left off. Let's pick up actually Tanya Kavase Dereish Lakish. So we'll say, which is about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, about 15 lines down from the top on Vav Amud Beis. So remember again a little bit we were talking about yesterday. We left off in the middle of Machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. What was the Machlokes? So the Machlokes was regarding the following. In a scenario where, again, Mishnah highlighted that one is not allowed to transact business or other types of deals with an akum within 3 days before their Yom Tiv. What happens if one did it? Right? What's the status of the proceeds of such a transaction? So Rabbi Yochanan said, Aser. Proceeds are asr ba'ana. Reish Lakish says the proceeds are mutter ba'ana. That's the fundamental machlokes. So that's what we're in the middle of right now. So the Gemara says, Tanya Kavas Reish Lakish. There's a price that supports Reish Lakish. Kisha amru asr v'lo seisi mohem. When Chazal said that you are not permitted to go ahead and do business with an akum, lo asru ela b'davar hamiskayim. They only prohibited something. Let's say, for example, selling the akum something that is going to last up until the Yom Tiv, up until their Yom Tiv. Because again, then the assumption is if the sold item will last up until their Yom Tiv, then halacha l'maisa, they'll give thanks to their deity. But let's say you sell them something that's not going to last. For example, to sell an akum vegetables. So if I sell the akum vegetables 3 days before their Yom Tiv, it's not going to last up until Yom Tiv. So Tani Rav Zivid, Beid Rav Oshia, Davar Shem Miskayim, Mochen Mehen, Aval Ein Mochen Mehen. So Rav Zivid partially agreed. He said the truth is you could sell them something that will not last, but you cannot purchase from them something that will not last. The logic being over there, because the Akam has tremendous simcha when he sells off something that he won't last. For example, again, vegetables, because he's able to go ahead and make money before it rots. Sigmar tells a story over here. Hahumina, very interesting story. Hahumina, the Shadale Dinara, so there was a particular min. A min is a heretic. There was a heretic who sent Rabbi Huda a special coin, dinar kisarna, literally again a Kesarian dinar. He sent him a gift. Now, when did this heretic send Rabbi Huda this gift? On his Yom Tiv, on the Avoda Zara Yom Tiv. So Haviyasa Reish Lakish coming. So Reish Lakish was sitting before Rabbi Huda. Amar Hechi Avid. So Rabbi Huda said, what should I do with the gift? Ashkale, if I accept the gift, Azal Umoda, then ultimately, again, this heretic, this min, will give thanks to his deity. And that's not good. Lo Ashkale, if I don't go ahead and accept it, Havila Eva, it's going to cause animosity. So also we're going to talk about this concept, about the concept of Eva, creation of animosity with the outside world, and how we have to be careful with that as well. So the Gemara talks, well, again, we'll see it in context. So Rabbi Huda Nesiya wasn't sure what to do with the coin. So Reish Lakish gives me an interesting answer. He says, Amar Reish Lakish, Tal Uzrako Salabar. just throw it into a pit. Just take the coin, throw it into a pit. The Gemara says, Tol v'zarak also the bar b'fanav. Just go throw it in the pit, in the face, right in front of this heretic. Amalei, Kloshkin to have the Eva. So to which Rabbi Yehuda says, well, one second, if we're concerned about creation of animosity, ain animosity gedolim mizo, right? That's gonna pretty much take the guy off. So to which Reish Lakish says, no, kila achra yatu the kamina. Reish Lakish says, I meant like kind of make it look like an accident. In other words, pretend like you tripped and like you lost the coin. So in other words, obviously you can't hold on to it because holding on to a gift, and I will say there's actually even a different kind of case because remember, this case over, we'll see this more in the next Mishnah. This case over here, the gift is actually being given on the Yom Tov itself, which is even a bit more problematic than the 3 days before the Yom Tov, as we'll discuss. So Reish Lakish essentially says to him, pretend like you tripped, you lost it. This way, again, you don't keep the gift, but you also don't create any additional animosity. Okay, so we'll say, so how do we pass in this Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, right? So at the end of the day over here, what do we do in this scenario? So remember again, so the Jew violated the rabbinic prohibition, transacted business with an akum on the 3 days before his Yom Tov. What is the halacha? So the Rambam paskins in Hilchos Avoda Zara, Perek Tes halacha. There's like a lot of halachas in this packed into this one halacha over here. The Rambam writes, Avar v'nasa anyone ba'osa shlosh yamim hare ze mutter b'hana. So the Rambam paskins that if you violated and you transacted business on the 3 days before their Yom Tiv, you are permitted to benefit from the proceeds. So the Rambam paskins like Reish Lakish. However, the Rambam does very interesting. However, it says v'hanose biyom chag gamimayim hare ze aser b'hana. If you transact business or any of these transactions with an akum on their Yom Tov itself, then the proceeds are aser b'hana. Right, so 3 days before, if you violated mutter b'hana, you could benefit from it. On the Yom Tov itself, can't benefit from it. All right, incredible. Let's go back to Lahash'ilan v'lishol mehen. So next, ultimately, again, Lash'il v'lishol mehen. So what about lending them or borrowing from them? So again, the Mishnah said both of these are prohibited in the 3 days before the Yom Tov. So b'shlom Lash'ilan the kamar v'chluhu. So I understand why I can't lend something to an akum in the 3 days before his Yom Tov, because again, I'm actively benefiting because again, he's growing his assets, right? He now has additional assets to his name. So the Gemara says, however, but why can't I borrow from him? Right, at the end of the day, to borrow from him, again, that's diminishing what he has. So why should that be prohibited? Abai says, we're concerned that if what? That if you borrow from them, you may come to go ahead and lend to them. That's Abai. Rava says, no, kula mishum the azil modu. So Rava says, no. The issue over here is in general, the akum is going to go ahead and give thanks to his deity. Now, so we're going to see this machlokes occur over and over. So what Rava is really saying is like this. When an akum sees that a Jew is dependent on him, that gives him simcha. So fascinating, right? That what does the world want? What has the world always wanted? The world has always wanted subservient Jews. That's what the world wants. The world always wants dependent Jews. So Lemaisa again, and that's why the world has such difficulty seeing when Jews stand up for themselves and when Jews fight back and when Jews don't have to rely on others. In any event, so Rava says over here that when the Jew borrows from the akum, as much as from an asset perspective, the akum has less. At the end of the day, he still will give thanks to his deity because the Jew is dependent on him. Therefore, again, you can't borrow or lend. Next, lahalvosam ululavos mehem, to lend or to borrow from them. So bishom lahalvosam mishum kamar v'chlu. So I understand why I can't lend the akum, because by lending him, right, he has more property, he has more assets. But why can't I borrow from him? Because again, the assumption over here is when you borrow, you're diminishing the assets of the akum. So once again, Abai says we're concerned that if we allow you to go ahead and borrow from them, you may come to lend them. Rava once again says, no. All of this is because when the akum sees that the Jew is dependent on him, he will give thanks to his deity. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Leforon, first wide line, Leforon for Leframehen, to go ahead and literally again pay back the akum and to collect payment from him. So the Gemara says, Bishlam alaparan. So I understand why I can't pay him back. Mishum de kamar v'chulu, because at the end of the day, I'm increasing his assets. But again, ultimately, to exact payments from the akum, that's diminishing his assets. Why should that not be mutter? Abai, once again, Abai is concerned if we allow you to go ahead and pay back, to extract payment, you may come to pay back. Rava Amar, Kula Mishum da Azulamodu. Rava says, no, all of this is because, again, the Akum feels a sense of gratitude when he knows that the Jew is dependent upon him. Incredible. So we'll say, so now the obvious question is, why do you need all these cases? In other words, whenever you see a repetition of cases and the cases are all highlighting the same basic core principle, the fundamental question comes up, just say the case once, highlight the principle, and we got it. We know how to apply things after the fact. To which the Gemara says, we need all of these cases. Why? So, because if the Tana, if the Mishnah would have just prohibited doing business with an akum in the 3 days before his Yom Tiv, because again, obviously, if you're purchasing something from the akum, he's gaining money. That makes sense that he'll go and give gratitude to his deity. But I would have thought that, like, to borrow money from the akum would have been fine, or to borrow something, because when you borrow something, you're taking the object away from the person. That wouldn't be a source of gratitude for the akum. Therefore, I would have thought that would be mutter. And if it would have just said you can't borrow from the akum, because when someone has to borrow something from you, we'll say, what does that show? When someone has to borrow something from you, what does that show? I have and you don't, right? I have and you don't. So you're dependent on me. So I thought, okay, therefore I can't do that with an akum because he's going to go ahead and give gratitude to his deity. Avalilvos mehen, but ultimately, again, to borrow money from an akum, that's Zara ba'alma. That is very interesting. To borrow money from someone only causes the lender tsar, right? Why does it cause the lender tsar? Because ultimately, again, he doesn't know if he's going to get paid back. So the Gemara says, "Asara ba'alma islay amar tuv lo hadrazuzi." Because whenever you lend money, there's always the possibility that's what you will not get paid back. So therefore, I would have thought that should have been mutter. Akum's not going to have simcha from that. So the Gemara goes right there. But even would have just told me the case that I can't borrow money. No, because the Akum will say, no, I'm going to get my money back one way or another. I'm going to extract my money from the Jew. The Sulo Hadri Zuzi Emat Zara is Levelo Azilamoda. But let's say to extract payments from an akum, I would have thought that's mutter, because there's no real simcha involved in that. Therefore, he's not going to go ahead and give thanks to his deity. And I would have thought that would be mutter. Therefore, tzricha. So we need all of these cases, because you would not be able to extrapolate one from the other. Bottom line, all of these things are going to be prohibited, either because the akum is going to be happy, because at the end of the day, he's gained something additional and going to give thanks to his deity, or he's going to be happy because someone else is dependent on him. The fact that someone else is dependent on him highlights his aggrandized status, and therefore he's going to give thanks to his deity as a result of that. And a Jew can't be involved in anything that in any way amplifies, increases, or enhances the relationship between the akum and his deity. Okay, incredible. Rabbi Huda in the front. So let's remember again, Rabbi Huda holds the halacha l'maisa. You are allowed to go ahead and extract payment from an akum 3 days before, right? Nifra in the hand. You can't collect payment. Why? Because Rabbi Huda assumes that halacha l'maisa, there is no simcha involved in going ahead and paying your debts. So therefore, again, the akum is not going to come to go ahead and give thanks to his deity because he repaid his debt. Now, interestingly enough, the Tanakama says, Amrulo, the Rabbanon say no, the Rabbanon say no, you can't collect the debt from the akum. Why? Because even if he's distressed, right in the moment about paying back, he'll be happy in the long run. He'll be happy in the long run, right? Because since he paid off instead, he'll be happy later on, and therefore he can't extract payment. So the Gemara says, 1 second. The Gemara says, I don't understand. Rabbi Huda, let's say Rabbi Huda, does Rabbi Huda supposed to say, so apparently, what's at the core of this machlokes over here between Rabbi Huda and Tanakama is this idea that if something causes you temporary sadness, but long-term happiness, are you allowed to engage in that type of transaction with an akum. So there's really only one thing that fits into that category, which is collecting payment from an akum. Right now will cause him distress, but later on it feels good to know that you paid off your debts. So Rabbi Yehuda says that's not a problem. We just look at what the transaction is now. We don't look at what it is in the future. Tanakama says, no, we look at what it is now and what it is in the future. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold to this concept. He doesn't hold to this concept that something that causes you temporary distress, but long-term happiness is considered in general to be a happiness transaction. So the Gemara says, Tanya, listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda, lo isha lo sasud b'moed, a woman should not go ahead and put lime on her face. So women used to use lime like as like a facial, right? So you cannot apply lime. So the way it worked with lime is when it was on you, it was distressing. You would leave it on for some amount of time, and then you would take it off, and it would, I guess, it does wonders for the complexion, right? In any event, so the Gemara says over here that a woman should not go ahead and apply lime on her face on Chalamayid, right? Why? Because it causes distress. It's going to take it from her Simchas Yamtiv because her face is covered with lime. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that if it's, I guess, like a shorter, like a facial of a shorter duration, where she could put the lime on and then peel it off, then it's okay, right? Why? Because even though it's distressing for her now, ultimately, again, she'll be happy afterwards with her complexion afterwards. So what do you see from here? Rabbi Yehuda does hold of this concept that aloch l'maisa, if you have an event or a transaction that causes short-term distress but long-term happiness, we look at that as a happiness transaction. If that's the case, then Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah should say you can't extract payments from an akum 3 days before his Yom Tiv, because even though it causes him immediate distress, it will cause him long-term happiness. Aram Nachar Bar Yitzchak, Hanach lehilchos moed, tekulu meitzer achshav simcha la'achar zman. So interesting. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says the truth is don't bring in the halachos of Chalamayid, because we're in general. Remember again on Chalamayid, you're really not allowed to do malacha. The only malacha you're allowed to do are things for ochel nefesh, and it perhaps to stave off some type of loss. So in general, anything you're allowed to do on Chalamayid is things that cause you temporary distress. In other words, because it's work, temporary distress, but for some longer term or for some down the road simcha. So you can't really bring a right from Chalamayid because Chalamayid is a little bit of a different construct. Ravina says, Oved kochavim le'inyan piron li'olam meitzar. So it's interesting. So Ravina says that in general, when it comes to paying back a debt, so an Oved kochavim is always in a state of distress. Paying back debts is just distressful for an akum. In other words, by a Jew, you could have the concept of something that is temporarily stressful, right? Temporarily difficult to yield long-term happiness. By an akum, they don't have that construct, and therefore payment of a debt is always just going to be distressful, or difficult. So I will say, by the way, this just happens to be a fascinating idea. Ravina just makes this in that it could very well be that the difference by the Jew, right? What is unique about our people, right? Just if you think about it, what is unique about Am Yisrael? What's unique about Am Yisrael? Am Yisrael could really be summarized in this one phrase: Afa pisha meitzer achshav sameach hu la'achar zman. Right? The whole yesod of Klal Yisrael is that we are willing and able to deal with immediate pain and immediate difficulty because we believe that it paves the way for long-term good. Is almost like our mantra. That's how we've gotten through everything in the last 2,000 years up to literally this present day, because we believe, right? Animamin b'emunah shalema, that the tsar of the achshav, the difficulties, the challenges of the now are only here to pave the way to some greater good later on. But that may be something, that hashkafa may be something that is unique to Klal Yisrael. It may be something that is unique to our people. It's embedded in our DNA, and it's what allows us to overcome every single challenge. And I will say, by the way, it's not just true on the national level, it's true on the personal level as well. How do we navigate life's challenges? Life is filled. I'm talking about just on a personal level, right? I'm not talking about Iran. I'm talking about us, like just like day to day in our own personal lives. how do we go ahead and navigate those things, which we encounter every single day? Because the hashkafa of the Yid is ava pisha mitzvah achshav. Life is incredibly difficult, maybe very difficult for me right now, but I believe with all of my heart, sameach hula achar zman. I will get through this. I will get through this. Not only will I get through this, ultimately, again, I'll be successful again. Not only will I be successful, but somehow, some way, this difficult circumstance will set me up for dynamic growth going forward. It's not just that I'll live through this. It's not just that I'll get through this. It's that this tsar, in and of itself, lays the foundation for the simcha that is going to come later on. This one line, I will say, this one line is anything, and this is what we are. This is who we are as a nation and as individuals. And Ravina comes along and says, by the way, Anovei Kochavim, they don't have this. They don't have this. They don't have this. Whether that means they live in the here and now, whether that means they lack the ability to have future-oriented perspective, to understand that the tsaras of today paved the way for the simchas of tomorrow. But Ravina is just simply saying this yisod of me'ava pisha meitzer achshav sameach hula achar zman. This is the hashkafa of the Yid and is unique to our people. Incredible, incredible. So the Gemara says, "Maslis lo b'shem bekarcha." Our Mishnah does not follow the view of b'shem bekarcha. What does b'shem bekarcha say? So b'shem bekarcha omer. Malva b'shtar. This is very interesting. Malva b'shtar ein nifra'in mehen. Malva al peh nifra'in mehen. V'veishav kameitz al yadam. So also, Rabbi Shmuel Silber makes a very interesting distinction here. Rabbi Shmuel Silber says that halacha l'maisa, everything depends on the nature of the loan. If I lent money to an akum, if I lent in a document, don't collect for the 3 days before their Yom Tov. Why? Just wait, because since I have a document, I'm good. I could collect whenever I want. If, however, it was a verbal loan or an oral loan, which is a very, 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 very bad idea, you collect that whenever you can, because that's always in fear of being lost. So if the only time to collect it is the 3 days before the Yom Tov, then ultimately, again, you take care of that then. So it's interesting, again, our Mishnah does not make that distinction. Yosef Rabbi Yosef Achari Rabbi Abba, Yosef Rabbi Abba Kameid Rav Huna, Yosef the Kamer, Hilchasa, Rabbi Yosef ben Karcha, Hilchasa, Rabbi Yehuda. So ultimately, again, so what happened? So Rabbi Yosef was sitting behind Rabbi Abba, and Rabbi Abba was sitting before Rav Huna, and Rav Huna said as follows: the halacha follows Rabbi Yosef ben Karcha, and the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. Hilchasa Rabbi Yosef ben Karcha, Hada Amran. So we'll say, so the halacha follows Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha. That's what we just said before. In other words, so ultimately, Rav Huna was making this distinction, and he said it depends on the nature of the loan. If it's a written loan, if it's a loan recorded in a document, do not collect it in the 3 days before the Yom Tov. Collect it afterwards because it will remain collectible. But if halacha l'maisa, again, it is a milva al peh, it is a verbal loan, then collect that as soon as you can, even in the 3 days. So that's the halacha there. What about Rabbi Yehuda? What does it mean? It says halacha like Rabbi Yehuda. What's Rabbi Yehuda's case? The Sanya. So what is actually very interesting case. We saw this before. Hano sein semer letzava letzbalo adam letzvao shachar. Shachar utzva adam. So we'll say, watch this case. I give my wool to a dyer, D-Y-E-R, right? I give my wool to a dyer. I say, well, dyer, I want you to dye it black. But he goes ahead and dyes it red. He dyes it red. So what's the halacha? What do we do over here? So both say top of Zayin with Aleph. So Meir says, no sin late, low sin low, demate samro. So Meir says essentially the dyer is obligated to refund me the value of unprocessed wool, undyed wool. In other words, he refunds me back what I gave to him, and he keeps the finished product. Okay? Rabbi Yehuda says no. Now, we'll say, now, the reason Rabbi Yehuda is dramatically opposed to that is because you set up a scenario where the dyer profits. Because think about this for just a moment, right? I told him I wanted it dyed black. He dyed it red. Still, okay, he didn't do what I wanted, but the value of dyed wool, we assume, is always greater than the value of undyed wool. So essentially what's going to happen over here is the dyer is going to get dyed wool for the value of, or for the price of undyed wool. So Yehuda says, how can you do that? You're allowing the dyer to profit, even though, again, he did something wrong. So Yehuda says like this, no sin less hayitzia. No sin less hashav. So Yehuda says like this. There are two costs over here, right? So I will say, so on one hand, there is the appreciation, right? How much more now is the wool worth? And there's the expenses. So essentially, Yehuda says the owner of the wool pays the dyer the lesser of those two amounts, right? So whatever is the lesser of the two, either the appreciation of the wool, now that it's dyed wool, or the expenses, he pays the dyer. So again, I, the owner of the wool, paid the dyer the lesser of those two amounts and take my wool back. So the Gemara says, and therefore, again, both says, coming back, so Rav Huna says that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda in this case. That in this case over here, again, I pay the dyer the lesser of the two expenses, the lesser of the two amounts being appreciation or expenses. Sadrin Rav Yosef la'apeh. So Rav Yosef heard this, and Rav Yosef turned away. Now, I'll say this act of turning away, right, was an act of like, what would you call this? Not disrespect, an act of displeasure with what was said, right? So he turned away as like very, very displeased with this whole discussion. So it's derech. So now why was he upset? So firstly, he said like this. I understand why you need to make a declarative statement that the halacha follows Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha, right? Why? Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha was one who said that in terms of this collecting of a debt from an akum, it all depends how the debt was recorded. If it's a debt in a document, you are not allowed to collect it on the 3 days before the Yom Tiv because it'll be collectible after the Yom Tiv. But if it's a verbal loan, you got to collect that as soon as you can because you're in real danger of losing that debt. So I understand why that statement had to be made. Why? Because Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha is arguing on the Rabbanan. Generally, the halacha is like this: when you have a machlokes in an individual and the group, the halacha follows who? The group. Kamashlan halacha ki yachid. But halacha l'mais again. Therefore, again, the Gemara is coming to tell us, or Rav Huna is coming to tell us that halacha l'maisa we paskin like Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha the yachid. So I understand why that statement was necessary. Halacha Rabbi Yehuda lovely. But why the need to make a declarative statement that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda? And I also remember again, bless you. What was Rabbi Yehuda? That's the case where I give the wool to the dyer, right? I want him to dye it black. He dyes it red. So Rabbi Yehuda says what? I give him the lower of the two. There are two amounts: appreciation or expenses. I pay him the lesser of those two amounts and take my wool back. But why was there the need to say the halacha was like Rabbi Yehuda? Pshita. That's obvious. Why? The machlokes the achar kach stam. Shabbos said this is fascinating. In Gemara, whenever you find two Mishnayos, Mishnah number 1 records a machlokes. Mishnah number 2 is a stam Mishnah. Now, what's a stam Mishnah? A stam Mishnah is a Mishnah that records one opinion without attribution. So whenever you have machlokes and then stam, the machlokes always follows the stam Mishnah. That is a Talmudic principle. Now watch this. I will say now in our case over here, machlokes the Baba Kama. Now I will say now ultimately again the machlokes that we quoted before is in Baba Kama. And so we'll say that's the Gemara that we just quoted before, right? Is Baba Kama, right? I know Saint Semer, Litzava Litzboa. So the machlokes Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Meir is in Baba Kama. Ustam bebab Mitzia. Then there's a Stam Mishnah Bab Mitzia. What's the Stam Mishnah Bab Mitzia? This nine. Hakola Mishane Yado ala Tachtona. V'chol HaChozer Bo Yada ala Tachtona. What was the Stam Mishnah in Bab Mitzia? The Mishnah said like this: whoever changes the what's the word? The parameters of an agreement he is put at the transactional disadvantage, just like the person who retracts is put at the transactional disadvantage. So what does that mean for our purposes over here? So again, remember, in this case over here, I gave the wool to the dyer. I want it black. He dyed it red. Because the dyer changed the parameters, he changed the details, therefore he is put at a disadvantage. That's a Stam Mishnah, which would then tell me that's what. Therefore, I only have to pay him the lower of the two expenses, the lower of the two amounts, either appreciation or expenses. So I have a Stam Mishnah. Now, boss, so what do I have? I have a machlokis in Baba Kama between, as we just mentioned before, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and then a Stam Mishnah that cements the halacha like Rabbi Yehuda. So whenever you have a machlokis and then a Stam, the machlokis always follows the Stam. So why the need to tell me that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda? That's obvious. That's why Rav Yosef was annoyed. So he turned to her like, what are you doing? Why are you making like such a declarative statement when it's obvious just based on Talmudic principles? For Rav Huna, so why did Rav Huna feel the need to say that halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda? Why did he feel the need? Listen to this, I will say. Mishum de'ein seder lemishnah. So this is very interesting because Rav Huna felt there's not necessarily an order to the Mishnah. What does this mean? The stam tana bereisha ve'achar kach machlokes. Because I will say, okay, Rav Huna will say like this. I agree with the principle that whenever there's machlokes and then stam, the machlokes follow the halacha follows the stam, which I will say makes sense, right? Because like Talmudically, what's happening over is like the Gemara goes and discusses the machlokes, and then the appearance of the stam says the halacha is like this. So that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. What was Rav Huna's problem? Rav Huna's problem, or what was Rav Huna's issue? Rav Huna said, well, there's not necessarily an order to the Mishnah. Because it's not an order, therefore what? It could very well be that what? That the stam came before the machlokes. Well, if the stam comes before the machlokes, then you can't apply this principle. The Gemara says, 1 second, hold up. Ihachi, kol machlokes vi'achar kach stam lema in seder Mishnah. Well, 1 second. If you're going to throw out that idea of in seder Mishnah, that there is no order to the Mishnah, then what have you done? What have you done? You've effectively imploded that entire principle. Then you can never rely on that principle of machlokes vi'achar kach stam, the halacha kistam. Why? Because who knows which really came first? To which the Gemara says, no. For Rav Huna, kilo aminon ein seder dechad masechta b'trei masechta aminon. To which the Gemara says like this. Rav Huna says like this. When do we rely on an order of mishnayos? That's in one masechta, right? In one masechta there is an order. In two masechtas, there's not necessarily an order. So in this case over here, because I have one Mishnah, so again, whenever you have two Mishnayos in one Masechta, so again, we could always say, machlokes v'achar kach stam. But in two separate Masechtas, there's not necessarily an order to the Mishnayos. So therefore, in our case over here, because one Mishnah is in Baba Kama, one Mishnah is in Baba Metzia, you can't rely on the principle of machlokes v'achar kach stam, halacha kistam. Therefore, Rav Huna felt compelled to say what? The halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, that again, that you pay the lesser of the two amounts. Incredible. For Rabbi Yosef on the other hand will say, now I will say, if that's the case, remember Rabbi Yosef was only turned away a little bit like in displeasure. So Rabbi Yosef, why are you getting all brightest? Rabbi Yosef, kulin azikin chad mesechtehi. Because Rabbi Yosef holds all of this interesting, all of the zikin has the status of one mesechta. And therefore, again, he felt that the statement, the halacha Rabbi Yehuda, was unnecessary because he could have just relied on the concept of stam, the achar kach, machlokes achar kach stam. V'ibay sema, mishum diktani legabi hilchas psikta. Rabbi Yosef also felt that this is different. Why is this case different? Because here in this type of case, the Mishnah itself gives a definitive ruling. What's the definitive ruling? The definitive ruling was, in general, if you change the deal, right? If you change the parameters of the transaction, you are put at a disadvantage. So Rav Yosef felt that that is such a declarative and accepted statement that there was no need to state the halacha follows like Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, which by the way, say the halacha does follow Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, let's just get that out of the way. The halacha does follow Rabbi Yehuda. That halacha, let me say again, in this kind of case, well, let's say again, I gave the wool to the dyer to dye it black. He dyed it red. I pay him the lesser of the two amounts, either the appreciation or expenses, and I get back my wool. That's the way it works. And indeed, it seems that the halacha follows Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha as well. But when it comes to collection of debts 3 days before the Yom Tiv, if the debt is recorded in the document, don't collect it. Just wait till after the Yom Tiv. However, again, if it's a verbal or an oral loan, halacha l'maisa collect it. Why? Because again, there you're in real fear, in real danger of losing the money. Tanabana, I boss, let's go right there. So now, by the way, that I mentioned Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha, we're just going to do a whole bunch of Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha cases, which are really great. So listen to this. So Tanabanan, Lo Yomar Adam Lechavera Hanira Shetamari Mila Erev. Supposed to listen to this. I need workers. I need workers. So I need Ruvain to come work for me. So I'm not allowed to say on Shabbos, Ruvain, maybe we'll meet up after Shabbos. So again, obviously, we're not catching a movie, right? But rather, again, I'm saying to him, maybe you'll show up, we'll work together. You'll come stand next to me after Shabbos, which is another way of saying maybe you'll come do some work for me on Motzei Shabbos. That's Tanakam. Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha Omer Adam lechaver nira shetamo imila erev. Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha says it's mutter. It's mutter. Now, why is it mutter? Because if you notice in that statement, I made no reference to work. So Rabbi Shimon Karacha says the only time that it's problematic is if I were to go ahead and make a mention of work. Will you come? Well, can we meet up on Motzei Shabbos so that you could go ahead and do some work for me on Motzei Shabbos? That'd be problematic. But to make a statement that doesn't reference work, but just says, it would be wonderful to see you, right? Will I see you on Motzei Shabbos? Rabbi Shimon Karacha says that is a mutter statement, makes no reference to work. Shabbos said this is part of the greater motif that in general, the way we speak on Shabbos has to be different than the way we speak during the week. So therefore, we speak about business matters during the week. We shouldn't speak about business matters on Shabbos. But Rabbi Shimon Karacha says as long as my speech doesn't reference any explicit business matters, it's going to be mutter. Amar Rabba Bar Bachana B'Yochanan Hilchasa Rabbi Shimon Karacha. And again, Rabbi Bachana says that is indeed how the Rambam paskins. That again, this statement, because at least just taken at its surface, is an innocuous statement. Well, I see you, right? We want to get together Matzeh Shabbos because it makes no explicit reference to business. Therefore, it is mutter. Tanabanan. So, what's another interesting case? So, I'll say, watch this. I asked the shaila to a chacham, and the chacham ruled that the item is tamei. Lo yishal lechacham v'yitar. Don't ask someone else. Right? Don't ask someone else in order to get a more lenient opinion. Or lechacham v'aser. Lo yishal lechacham v'yatir. If you ask the shaila and the answer is aser, don't ask another shaila in order to get an answer of mutter. Hayu shnayim. What happens if there are two rabbanim, two chachamim? So what happens if you happen to ask two rabbanim, right? Two chacham are sitting next to each other. You ask the shaila. One says tamei, one says tar. One says mutar, one says aser. So what's the halacha? Halach achara. So we'll say if one of them is greater than the other. Now it's interesting. Lashon over here is chachma b'minyan. That's more of an expression, right? So again, if one of them is greater than the other, then what's the halacha? Halach acharav. Then follow the greater chacham. Ve'im lav halach achar hamachmir. And if not, follow the machmir opinion. So we'll say now, watch this. Rabbi Shimon Karacha says, hold up there. So we actually quoted this on Shavuos night in our topic. Rabbi Shimon Karacha Omer b'shal Torah halach achar hamachmir. B'shal Sofrim halach achar hamachmir. Shimon Karacha says, hold up. You don't always have to be machmir. In a case of biblical law, in other words, if the shaila is a biblical one, okay, then go after the machmir opinion. If the shaila is a rabbinic one, then ultimately again go after the lenient opinion. Rabbi Yosef. And Rabbi Yosef says that Allah and Rabbi say that is again indeed how we paskin, right? Again, when you have a suffix in halacha, so suffix da'oraisa l'chumra, doubt in biblical law will go l'chumra. Suffix d'rabbanan, ultimately again l'kula. T'rabbanan, both say more Rabbi Shimon Karacha. So t'rabbanan, v'kulan shechazru b'hen ein mekablan oson olamas. The Rebbe Meir. So both say this is an incredible case. So let's say I have someone who is pasala edus because of their behavior. So Rashi points out over here, Gazlonan va'ameh haaretz. Now it's interesting that Rashi includes over here an amma haaretz. Let's leave amma haaretz out for just a little bit. Let's focus on the Gazlan, a thief. A thief is pasala edus. So I'll say, this by the way, such an incredible Gemara. Right? So now let's say you have a thief, and the thief did tshuva. Does tshuva restore his ne'emanos? Does it restore ultimately again his believability or reliability? Does it restore his status as being someone who's trustworthy? So now, for example, is he allowed to show up in Beis Din and go ahead and give testimony? So Rabbi Meir says no. Ein mekablan osan olamis. No, once you ruin your status, once you ruin your credibility, you cannot restore it. A scary shita. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Chazu b'ayim matmonios in mekablan osan befarhesia mekablan osan." So also Rabbi Yehuda says something very interesting. Rabbi Yehuda seems to say, now the way it literally translates is like this: if he did tshuva privately, we do not restore his credibility. If he did tshuva publicly, we restore his credibility. So we'll say, which is interesting. So it sounds like, again, everything depends on the public versus the private nature of the tshuva. Ike de Amri, alternate version of this, asu divrei matmonios mikablan osan. So Amud Beis. So we'll say the alternate version of this is, what was the nature of the avera? If he did the avera, if the avera was an avera done privately, then ultimately, again, credibility can be restored. If it's a public avera, credibility can't be restored. What's the logic over there? They will say all of us commit averos, but at least if I commit an avera, ultimately what? To be able to do it privately, right? Because what does a private avera show? What does a private avera highlight? That halacha l'maisa, there's a sense of shame, right? If I do something privately, and I will say shame is incredibly important because what does shame highlight? What does shame highlight? Right? That I know what I'm doing is wrong. I will say the most important. Okay, I'm not going to say raise your hand if you've sinned, right? Right? Because Lamaisa, we've all sinned. I'm pretty sure actually we've probably even committed averas since we woke up this morning, right? It's only 6:31, right? I'm sure some of us are already a couple of averas into the day, right? So Lamaisa, the fact that we sin, that's obvious. What is incredibly important is that halacha Lamaisa, we feel a sense of embarrassment about it. Because at least you see, the greatest challenge is not when you sin. What's the greatest challenge? When I begin to justify my sins, right? That's where there's a lot of challenge. Because people, we do this all the time, and it's incredible how we do this, right? We go ahead and we make excuses why this is not a bad behavior, or the truth is I'm not bound by other things because I have a different hashkafa, or this or that. We come up with all kinds of creative reasons why we are allowed to do the negative behaviors. And besides the fact that it's just exhausting, right, it's so much better instead to say, I'm a human being, I'm frail, I make mistakes. And maybe even be more honest and say, you know what? I'm not even correcting certain things right now. I don't even, as long as I keep constantly in mind that I know that it's wrong. We all live like this in life with certain things. I know that it's wrong, but I'm still doing it. We have to always remember, we have to be honest with ourselves and honest with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. So Rebbe Shalom has tremendous patience for someone who sins and is honest. Where he loses his divine patience is when we sin and we're dishonest. We pretend that it's not a problem. So the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says everything depends on how you sin. If you sin privately, that means there's a sense of busha. If there's busha, if there's embarrassment, that means I know that it's wrong. If I know that it's wrong, that means that there's tremendous hope for me because my moral compass is intact. When a person sins publicly, public sinning is a much bigger deal because public sinning means that to a certain degree, a person has lost their moral compass. So in the Igidami over here, Rabbi Yehuda says like this: if you sin publicly, you cannot restore your credibility. If you sin privately, you can restore your credibility. Rabbi say, get ready for this. The best line in today's daf. I know I should say they're all excellent line in today's daf. One of the best lines on a personal level. Rabbi Shimon, Karcha Omri, both say Zaina with the second line. Ben kach u ben kach mekablim. No, doesn't matter what you did. Doesn't matter what you did. You sin privately, you sin publicly. You do tshuva privately, you do tshuva publicly. Whatever you do, you can always restore your credibility. Why? Because no matter how severe the sin, no matter the location of the sin, no matter you justify to yourself, you lie to yourself, you're honest, you're dishonest, whatever you did, whoever you are, tshuva is always accessible. Shne'emar, shuvu banim shovavim. One simple statement: return wayward sons. Who's the wayward son? Who's the wayward son? It's me. Who's the wayward son? It's you. We're all the wayward sons. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu sees all of us and says, just come back. Just come back. Just come back. Just get things together. Just get things on the rails. Stop spending all of your mental and emotional energy trying to justify why you did and why it's really not wrong. Just own it. Just lean into it. Just accept it. We all sin all the time. We're all doing things against the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But if we just get our act together and just own what we've done, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm waiting for you. The door's open. The door's open. And we're going to say there's no judgment. There is judgment, but the door's still open. Shuvu banim shovavim. So Rabbi Shimon Karcha says, no matter what you've done, no matter who you are, you can always restore your credibility. Incredible. And both say this is the best line in the world. Rabbi Yochanan, Hilchasa, Kosa Hazuk. Rabbi Yochanan says, the halacha l'maisa and the hashkafa l'maisa follows Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. Halacha l'maisa, anyone could restore their credibility. Obviously, and both say from a judicial perspective or from an edus perspective, there are certain steps a person has to take in order to restore their credibility. That is absolutely the halacha. But from a hashkafic perspective, no matter what I've done, no matter how badly I've messed up in life, the door to tshuva is always open. Shuvu banim shuvin. Remember again, who even heard this statement? Who even heard this? Even Elisha ben Avuya. right? Even Elisha ben Avuya heard this statement. Everyone, if your neshama hears, Kadosh Baruch Hu calls out every single day, Shuvu banim shovavim, the neshama hears it. I just have to be courageous enough to act on it. Incredible. All right, Rabbosai, Mazel Tov on finishing the first Mishnah in Maseches Avoda Zara. Now it's a long Mishnah. Now, long Gemara. Now our second Mishnah. Here we go. So Rabbi Shmuel, we actually referenced this in yesterday's daf a little bit. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Shlosh Lifneim uShlosh Lachareim Aser. Rabbi Shmuel actually holds that it's not only the 3 days before their Yom Tiv, but it's the 3 days after their Yom Tiv that you're not allowed to transact with an akum as well. The Chum say Lifnei Idehen Aser, the Acher Idehen Mutter. The Chum on the other hand say no. It's only the 3 days before their Yom Tiv that's problematic, not the 3 days afterwards. So says the Gemara, Amrav Tachlifa Barabdimi, Amr Shmuel, Yom Echad Di Rabbi Shmuel, the Olam Aser. So also remember again, we saw this in yesterday's daf. Rabbi Shmuel holds Sundays. You are never allowed to transact with an akum on Sunday. Sunday is their Yom Tiv, therefore not Sunday. And I remember again, according to Rabbi Shmuel also holds that the 3 days don't include the day of. So effectively, according to Rabbi Shmuel, you're really never allowed to transact business with an akum. But again, that was yesterday's daf. The Chum said the Fnei Dein Asalachar Day Motor. Chum had a Tanakama. So we'll say, so the Chumim of our Mishnah seem to be saying the same thing as the Tanakama of the first Mishnah, right? They seem to be saying the same exact thing. You're not allowed to transact business, or you're not, I should say business, you're not allowed to engage in transactional activity with an akum 3 days before his Yom Tiv. So again, the Chachamim of our Mishnah seem to be saying the same exact thing as the Tanakama of the previous Mishnah. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, maybe, hey, below Idein Ikabenahu. So maybe the point of the contention, Rabbi say, is going back to yesterday's daf, do the 3 days include the Yom Tiv, or is it 3 days not including the Yom Tiv? So the Gemara says, Tanakama Savra Hein below Idein. The Tanakama, the previous Mishnah holds that it's 3 days plus the Yom Tiv, so a total of 4 days. For Rabbanan Basrai Savri Hein V'Idein, whereas the Rabbanan of our Mishnah might hold that no, the 3 days includes the Yom Tov itself. Another potential point. In other words, all we're trying to do is try to figure out the distinction between the Chachamim of our Mishnah and the Tanakama of the previous Mishnah, who seem to be saying the same thing. The other possibility is Nasa v'Nasan Ika Beinahu. So we'll say that possibility is what happens if you violated and you did transact with the akum in the 3 days before the Yom Tov. What is the status of the proceeds? So the Gemara says, Tanakama Savar Nasa v'Nasan Mutar. All right, the previous Mishnah, Tanakama held that the proceeds, although you did something prohibited, the proceeds are permitted. Rabbanan Basrai Savri Nasa v'Nasan Aser. Whereas the Rabbanan of our Mishnah hold that no, the proceeds will be prohibited. Okay, so another possibility is the Shmuel Ikabenahu. The point of contention between them is Shmuel. Damer Shmuel. Shmuel said, Bagola. We'll say this is great. This is great. Shmuel said in the diaspora. So we'll say, remember again, there are Ovdei Kochavim in Eretz Yisrael and Ovdei in Chutz La'aretz. So we'll say, get ready for this. Shmuel says in the diaspora, when it comes to transacting with an Ovdei Kochavim, ultimately again, you only have to worry about transacting with them on the day of their Yom Tov itself. Now, what's the reason for that? So we'll say, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says Bagola. Rashi says this is great. Ein ha'ovdei kochavim adukin kol kach ba'avodas kochavim. Ki darmina lekaman ovdei kochavim shebechutz la'aretz lav ovdei kochavim ninhu. For all of us supposed to listen to this. Apparently, the ovdei kochavim of chutz la'aretz are not so frum. They're not so frum. They're not so committed. I will say it's fascinating. The chutz la'aretz of the Kochavim, they're not as intense. Like a shtickle, like I don't know, whatever. They're modern of the Kochavim, I don't know, whatever it is. They're off the derech of the Kochavim, whatever it might be. So Lemais, it's fascinating. So therefore, again, I both say, and again, we're going to see this sugya. That ultimately, again, in the Gola, in the diaspora, I'm sorry. Shmuel's statement. So Bagola and Aser, so again, Shmuel holds that in the Golden diaspora, ultimately, again, only transacting with them on the day of the actual Yom Tov is problematic, but ultimately, again, but the other 3 days are not. So Tanakama is like the Shmuel. So Tanakama, in other words, our previous Mishnah holds like Shmuel, and ultimately Rabbanim Basrai less than Shmuel, but the later Rabbanim ultimately, again, don't hold of Shmuel. Okay, Ibai, same with the other possibility is the Nachum Hamadi Ikabeinahu. Right. Ultimately, again, so other possibilities, and this is incredible because this is actually going to fuel a lot of our next sugyas. The statement of Nachum Hamadi ultimately again is the point of contention. The Sanya Nachum Hamadi Omer Eino Aser Ela Yom Echad Lifnei Idehen. So we'll say there's another sheet over here. Nachum Hamadi holds that there's no 3 days. There's only 1 day. There's only 1 day. There's 1 day ultimately again that is problematic. Tanakama, Leslie de Nachum Hamadi. So ultimately, again, the Tanakama, the previous Mishnah, does not hold of Nachum Hamadi. But Rabbanim Basrai, Islu de Nachum Hamadi. Whereas the later Rabbanim ultimately, again, hold of Nachum Hamadi. Okay, so we'll say, point over here is, although it sounds like the Chachamim of our Mishnah are saying the same thing as the Tanakama of the previous Mishnah, they are in fact separate and distinct opinions. So we'll say, first wide line, Zayin days. Gufa. Nachum Hamadi Omer Eino Aser El Yom Echad B'fnei Idehen. So we'll say, now listen to this. So Nachum Hamadi is of the opinion. He says that it's not 3 days that are prohibited from transactional activity, but rather what? 1 day. So listen to this. Amrulo. So they said to Nachum Hamadi, Nishtaka Davar V'lo Ne'emar. Right? Let's forget that and let's not talk about it. Right? That's not, in other words, another way of saying incorrect. Incorrect. Let's not talk about it. Va'ika. Rabbanan Basrai come say, but 1 second. You just said before that the Rabbanan of our Mishnah hold like that. So how can we forget it? The Gemara says, Man Chachamim, no. Who are the Chacham of our Mishnah? So that means that it's not Chamamadi. So there is this singular opinion that it's not 3 days, rather it's 1 day. And you now have the Chacham saying, forget about that sheet, we don't talk about it. Tanya Idach. Nachum Hamadi Omer. So we'll say, so now that we mentioned Nachum Hamadi, we're going to keep mentioning Nachum Hamadi again. So we'll say, so I just want to point out that in this discussion regarding like days that are transactionally prohibited, essentially what you see over here is as follows. You really have 3 different opinions. There is this opinion of the Rabbanan, or Tanakam will call it, 3 days before the Yom Tiv, right? There's the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, 3 days before, 3 days after, and then apparently there is this opinion of Nachum Hamadi that just 1 day before. 1 day before. Now, Nachum Hamadi seems to be taken out of play immediately, right? That Lamai said no one subscribes this, so we take him out. But just understand that he's there. Now that we mentioned Nachum Hamadi, the Gemara is going to quote him on Nachum Hamadi. So this is interesting. Tanya Idach, Nachum Hamadi Omer, Mochel and Sus Zachar, V'zaki b'Melchama. So we'll say this is very interesting. So let me tell you this. I'll tell you this for a moment outside, then we're going to stop up here actually. We're going to talk about this. There's this concept, a rabbinic concept, that you're not allowed to sell certain types of animals to a Behema Gasa, large animals to non-Jews. We'll get into that, why that is. It's actually a Shabbos issue. A Shabbos issue. There's another interesting discussion about going ahead and selling. What about sell? Well, no, fine. Let's just do it. So Gemara says as follows. So if you look at Rashi says over here, Mochel and Sus Zakin, B'socha Mochama Sheina Lekabel, Umos Lo Shchichahu, V'lo Asi LeMichlav Micharem. So we'll say, so now the Shaila the Nachamadi says like this: you could sell a zachar, a male horse that is old, right? So an older horse, ultimately again to an akum during war. Now, what does this mean? So actually, I was saying, I'm stopping here for today. I'm not going to rush through it. Stop here for today. I will say tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh. Tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh. So Meretz Hashem, we begin at 5:45. Meretz Hashem, Shachris at 7 o'clock. We're also doing an additional Hisorus. Sorry, 6:30 Shachris. We'll also be in Meretz Hashem tomorrow, an additional Hisorus minyan. Meretz Hashem with some additional singing, some music. Meretz Hashem, that'll be at 7 o'clock a.m. tomorrow. I'm sorry? Tomorrow. Right, I have some information correct, right? So Meretz Hashem, so that'll be tomorrow, 7 o'clock. Also, we put that out on the email as well. Shkarach will say, stop over for today. We have a lot to do tomorrow, but Meretz Hashem, we will get through it. Shkoyach. All right, have a great day, everyone.